everybody, and especially folks who are not able to join us today. Happy birthday to those in the Stamp Club who've had birthdays this weekend. I hope everybody is able to get outside and enjoy some of the sunshine, and that you're not too inundated with the pollen that's out there right now. But I want to flip my camera over because we're going to do a really fun card. It's kind of a double card in one. And there's a really fun technique using designer series paper. So it looks like the entire design carries across both cards. And I'm just going to flip this and then we'll get going. And we do have some members of the Stamp Club who are on today, and we're going to use this as just a very interactive session. So if there are any questions or comments, just jump in. But this is an example of the card. And as you can see, it is using one piece of designer series paper. I hope you can see that the design carries forward. You can see a little kind of a swoosh that goes over, and the hills go over. So this was one piece. The piece that is on the front of the card, the piece that's on this side, and the piece that is on the back. That was all one piece of designer series paper. And I'm going to show you how to cut that and then put the card together. And it's really not difficult. And I really hope that you enjoy making it. Let me talk about some of the pieces that go into this card. And then we can also talk about some options, because the options are definitely not limited to the designer series paper that I used. I used a piece from the New Horizons designer series paper. It is in the current mini catalog, and it starts as a 6x6. So the piece that is on the left started at the same size as it is on the right. This is actually 6x6. And because I knew that I was going to make a landscape card, I purposely cut my paper in a landscape fashion. And I'm just going to be pulling directions in and out. I will post this as well, so you have the directions for the sizes of the paper. But you'll notice that the designer series paper piece needs to be cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. And as I mentioned, keep in mind that that is going to be a landscape. So when you cut that, you're going to cut it so it's 4 inches high and 5 1/4 inches wide, because you are going to do this as a landscape. And what I chose to do when I picked that piece of cardstock is I wanted to focus on an area that I thought would be a really pretty design, one that would carry from left to right and from top to bottom, and just had a really pretty picture. I've got a couple other examples that I think personally would work really well for this kind of card. This is from the Daffodil designer series paper that was part of the recent celebration. And this again is it's kind of a large design, and it carries as a picture. So even when we cut it up, visually your brain is going to fill in the blanks and you would see the entire design. So that's an option that I think would work really well. And another option is from Flowering Fields. And again, this is a very bold, big design. It is continuous top to bottom, left to right, and has some just really nice, impactful flowers. So that would also, I think, be a really good option. So these are just a couple of options that I think would work well. And you're going to find when you look at your paper that there are many others that you can use. I am going to essentially recreate this card. Okay. And I probably didn't cut the paper exactly the same, and I didn't. You can see down here on the bottom right, I didn't cut it at the exact same point, but it really doesn't matter, because we're going to use this piece and kind of recreate this card. The first thing that we are going to do is we're going to cut out the designer series paper part that's going to go on this front card. So we've got a card within a card, and this is how it works. So when I open up the front, I have another panel that gives me the inside. So it's like a little card inside the outside card base. And the first thing I want to do is cut that piece of designer series paper that's going to go on this top flap. I went back to a tried and true set of dies when I figured out the dimensions for this card. And I'm using the stitched rectangle dies. And I love these. I've used them way, way, way too many times. And this is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th down in terms of size, or the 4th up in terms of size. And it measures about 2 1/4 by 3 5/8 or so when it cuts the piece out of the center. So in other words, the piece of designer series paper that I got out of the middle when I cut this is about 2 1/4 by about 3 5/8. Just so you have an idea of the size. You do not need this set of dies to make this card. I do highly recommend either using rectangle dies or square dies. They're going to be much easier to get everything aligned, and it is going to be much easier to figure out the size of the color cardstock that you're going to need to cut. So rectangles or squares is what I would definitely recommend that you use. So let's talk about what you're going to need to do. I'm going to grab my piece of designer series paper. And again, this is the one that I cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. And what I need to do, and what I want to do, is I want to cut the rectangle from the center. And I'm going to try to get this die centered horizontally and vertically. So I'm really trying to get it in the middle. And one thing that I like to use to do that is either grid paper, or this is an extra foam mat that goes in the Stamparatus. Grid paper would work just as well. And the reason that I like that is I can line up my paper, and then visually I can line up my dies a little bit better. So let's talk about this. This piece is 4 inches high. So you can see that you've got a darker line going horizontally at each inch. So I can get this between 2 of those dark lines. And on a grid piece of paper, you probably are going to have 1 inch markings as well. And then if I center this, and I'm going to use, let's see, I'll use this one as a center. I'm going to bring that so you can see. Let me show you on either side. See where these dark lines are? I've got a dark line going down right here, and I've got a dark line going down right here. And it is 1/4 and then 1/2. So it's about 3/8 of an inch from that dark line and 3/8 of an inch from this dark line. So that's pretty centered. And then I'm going to put my die on here. What I might do is I might just to try to keep this a little straight, I'm just going to put a little piece of washi on there. Just so when I'm putting my die on here, I'm not moving it around too much. And then all I'm going to do is visually look at these dark lines, which are parallel with these. And I'm just going to try and sort of center it. So I've got a dark line here on either side, a dark line here on either side, and I'm just trying to center it. And you don't need to get this exact because of the way that we're going to put it together, but as close-ish as you can get, it's going to look better when you put the final pieces on. You definitely wouldn't want to die cut way up in that corner or way off to the side. So you're just going to try to get that in the middle as best as you can. And again, I think using grid paper gives you just a nice little visual of what you want to do. And then I've got a couple pieces of washi tape. I'm just putting those on and off the back of my hand to get them to be a little less sticky. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to washi tape that die to my paper. And if you had a square, you would be doing the same thing where you'd be trying to sort of visually line it up as best as you can in the middle. And then I'm going to take this off to the side and I'm going to run it through my die cutting machine. And because I did this before I got on here this afternoon, I've already got one piece that is die cut. So here's what I'm going to end up with. I've got a piece that obviously started at the 4 by 5 1/4. And now I've got the center piece that is die cut directly from the middle. So we have essentially 2 pieces of designer series paper at this point. We need 3 to do this card. We have the one that is going to go on the second card. That's going to be this one. And then we're going to need 1 piece that is going to go on the side, the left side of the card when you open it. So obviously that's going to have to come from this part of the paper. And then we've got another piece that is going to go in the back of the card. And that's going to have to come from this part of the paper. So what we need to do, nothing magical, crazy, or difficult, is we need to cut this piece of paper. And we need to cut that in half. We need to cut that in half because we're going to put 1/2 on the left, 1/2 on the right. So I'm just going to get my paper cutter in here. This is 5 1/4. So 5 1/4. If you take half of 5 1/4, you are going to get to 3 7/8. And let's think about that. Let's just do a little bit of math. I know, craziness, right? So 5 1/4. 5, half of 5 is 2 1/2. So I'm moving that over to 2 1/2. But then we need to add in half of a quarter. Half of a quarter is 1/8. So if I move that over, it is 3 5/8. I think I said 3 7/8. It's really 3 5/8. And I'm going to just look at that and make sure that that makes sense to me. And I'm going to do the math one more time. So 5 1/4, half of 5 is 2 1/2. Half of a quarter is 1/8. So 2 1/2 plus a quarter is 2 1/2 plus a quarter is 2 5/8. And I'm going to cut that right in half. So I'm going to end up with 2 halves. I'm just going to get that out of the way. And we can test this and make sure that we calculated correctly by simply putting them side by side, and they are the same height. So again, you're going to cut that at 2 5/8. All right, so we have our 3 pieces of designer series paper. We're going to tuck those over to the side for just a minute, and we're going to now work on our card base and the piece that we will use for the center card, for the little card. So let's look at this. We've got a card base that is the full 5 1/4, and then we've got a partial card over here, and it's at 4 1/4. To make the card base, the part that is in the back that has that score and fold, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one piece of just regular cardstock. This is 8 1/2 by 11. So 8 1/2 by 11. I'm going to turn it so that I am actually putting the cardstock into my cutter on the 11-inch line. because what I want to cut is a piece of cardstock that is 4 1/4 by 8 1/4. So let's think about this for a minute. If a standard piece of cardstock is 8 1/2, if I cut it so my 8 1/2 is going to be the longest length, all I will need to do is cut off 1/4 of an inch. So I need to cut this to 4 1/4 by 8 1/4. So I'm going to put this in at 4 1/4. And again, I've got it so the 11 inches is horizontal. I'm going to cut that. So now I've got a piece of paper that is 4 1/4 by 8 1/2. Well, I only need it to be 4 1/4 by 8 1/4. So I'm going to put this back in. And this time I have it on the 8 1/2 inch side going horizontally. And I'm just going to cut 1/4 of an inch off the end. So that's all the paper that I'm going to waste, or I'll have a nice little piece of scrap paper that I may want to use. Okay, then to complete the card base, we have our 4 1/4 by 8 1/4, and now we need to score that. And we are going to score that at 2 3/4 on the 8 1/4 side. So I'm just going to get my scoring board in here. I'm going to bring in my piece of color cardstock, and I'm going to go to 2 3/4. So right at 2 3/4, and I'm going to go ahead and score. All right. And then I'm going to go ahead and burnish that. And what I'm going to end up with is a piece that is going to have an opening on this side. And the reason I scored that at 2 3/4 is this measurement on the left side is 2 3/4. And then if I went from where this half meets the back, this is 2 3/4. So the back of this card is going to be 5 1/2, which is a standard A2 by 4 1/4. So I've really created kind of half of the front. You'll see this will make sense in a minute. Half of the front of a regular A2 size card. So now what we can do is we can attach 2 pieces of our designer series paper. We're going to attach the pieces that we had cut in half after the center piece was cut out. And we're going to put those onto our card. The first one we are going to attach is the one that's going to go on this flap. So it's going to be the same as the one that is on the bottom of this flap. And the way that we're going to do that is before you do anything, look at the pieces that you cut out and just make sure that you have them in the right orientation. You know which is the left and you know which is the right. Take the right and just get that out of the way, just so you don't get it mixed up. And what we're going to do is we're going to flip our card base so that we've got our flap, and that flap is kind of sticking up toward us. And what we want to do is we want to adhere the piece that we cut off so that the edge is flush up against the edge of that little part of the card. And you also want to try to get as much of a border on the left as you have on the right. And it's going to be about 1/8 of an inch on the border. And I'm going to use Tombow to do this. And just put, you don't need to put a ton of glue on this, but you could get some on kind of all the sides. I don't recommend that you get it too close to the upper part where I'm pointing right now. You don't want to get it too close to here or here, because you can get a little bit too much right at the edge, and that can cause some problems, but a little bit of tackiness that you don't want to have. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm taking that piece and I am intentionally putting it right up against the edge. And I can use my fingers and just try to get that right at the edge. And also I'm trying to get as much of a border on the left and on the right. And if the border isn't exact, let it go. In the end, it is really, really, really not going to matter. All right, so we've got one piece attached. The reason that we did this one first is now we have something to use to line up the second piece. And what we're going to do is we are going to visually look at where the top and the bottom of this horizontal part is, and the same thing on the bottom piece there. And you're going to push this. So when I put this on, I'm going to put my left hand over here. I'm going to push that piece down. And then when I adhere this piece, it's almost like there's a buffer. There's a layer of cardstock. And what you can do is you can align where that piece of paper is going to go. And it should give you pretty much the same border on the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and add the glue on here as well. You should not do this in the opposite order because you won't be able to get them aligned. So by putting that left side on first, you have a clue, a visual clue as far as where you're going to put that. All right, so I've got my second piece with some Tombow. I'm going to hold this down and then I'm going to kind of lift it up the right side of the piece that I'm putting down. I'm just going to align that. And I'm going to stand up because I can see this a little bit better. Just going to try and get that as straight as I can. And what's interesting is this piece of paper, part of it, it might try to bend a little bit, but you can get it so that that design is going all the way across and you've got your lines going fairly straight. Now, is that border going to be perfect all the way around? No, but it doesn't matter because what you're really looking at is your picture continuous? Does it look like that piece of paper is continuous? And the answer is yes. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is we need to do a little bit of calculating. And the reason that when I sent the instructions out to everybody, I said that you need to have some additional cardstock because we're going to be cutting out, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to cut out this card, the one that is in the middle. Well, I wasn't really able to tell you what size to cut this because I don't know if you were going to use the same die that I did. Maybe you were, maybe you weren't. And it doesn't matter because I'm going to tell you how to calculate what size piece of paper you need for that particular piece. And here's what you're going to do. You have this piece that you cut out, the center piece that you cut out from your designer series paper. So what you need to do is grab a ruler. And when you grab that ruler, you're going to measure the size of this piece. And when I measure this, I get about 3 5/8. I made it, I rounded it up a little bit. So 3 5/8 by 2 1/4. All right. So let me write that down. So my piece, which may or may not be the same size as yours, is 2 1/4 by 3 5/8. So what I want is I want a piece that is going to be taller and wider because I want a border around it. kind of like the border that I have around all the pieces that I've put together. So if I look at the card that we're making, I've got a border all the way around. I want a border around this piece when I put it back in. I don't want to just put it right straight down on that card. That's not going to look the way I want it to. So for me, I knew that I had about 1/8 of an inch on the border. Well, for 1/8 of an inch on either side, that means a total of 1/4 of an inch. Just bear with me on this. So if I say plus 1/4 of an inch, then for me, I need something that's about 2.5 inches high. So this is 2.5 inches high. And then just bear with me. You add 1/4 to this, you're going to get, let's see. 2 eighths, 7 eighths. So you get 3 7/8. And then whatever the length is, whatever the amount is here on your length, and you add a little bit of a buffer, you need to multiply that by 2 because you need both the front and the back. So if you are using the same dies that I am using with the rectangle dies, the size that you're going to need for this inside card is going to be 2.5 by 7 3/4. It's 2.5 inches high because it's going to be just a little bit higher than this piece. And it's 7 3/4, which is twice the amount of 3 7/8. So don't go completely loopy on this because there's an easy way to do this as well. If you hate math, I'm sorry, and I apologize, but you can also take your ruler and you can figure out how long that piece is, add just a little bit more length, draw that out. So actually draw out that rectangle, which is going to be, a little bit bigger than this. And then take your piece of paper. Let me do this so that I've got a clean piece so you can actually tell what I'm doing here. I take my piece of paper and I get my ruler and I put it down so that I've got a border. And I'm going to put a couple little dots just around where I want that size to be. And then I take this piece of paper and I move it again. And I do the same thing. And I figure out if I need to go from those dots and make one piece, about how big is it? And I just connect the dots. Then I'm going to see the size paper that I need to cut. And that's what you're going to need to do. You're just going to need to cut a piece of cardstock that is going to be twice the size of a nice border around the piece that you cut out for the middle designer series paper. And the measured amount that I had, it's pretty close. This is about 2.5. And I wanted it to be a total of 7 3/4. And it's about that. So it's a fairly good way to kind of gauge what it is that you would cut. All right. So for me, using the die that I used, I'm going to cut my piece to 2.5 by 7 3/4. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to use that same piece of cardstock that I started with. This is the one that I cut off 4¼ by 8¼ and I'm just checking to see this is the 8½ inch line. So I'm going to put that back in. I'm going to cut it at 2½. And then I'm going to take off 3/4 inch. That's going to get me down to 7 3/4 because 8½ less 3/4 inch is going to get me to 7 3/4. And this is what I want for that inside piece. And I'm going to fold it or score it in half. And I'm going to score it just because I want to score it. But once you've cut that piece that's going to be the inside of that little card on the inside, you're just going to score that and fold it in half. Or if you want to fold it in half, you can just do it that way. Half of this is going to be 3 7/8. So right at 3 7/8 is going to be my halfway mark. And it's going to score that. And then I will fold that right in half. All right. Now, one more piece that you need, and then we're going to be done with the wrap. You're going to need one more piece of color cardstock. And let's think about this. It is this little piece right here. If I pull this by itself, the piece of color cardstock that has the hey there is right behind the sentiment. And notice that it is the same height as the card that we just made, that little card that we just made. And when I fold over the card, it aligns with the card on the top. It actually, the card that folds over covers this piece of cardstock. So it needs to be 1/4 or half as long as the piece that we just did. So in other words, it needs to be half of one side of the card that we just did. Because when I put this card in, I'm going to put it on here so that when I open it up, it's going to cover up that piece. I know that it needs to be 2½ inches high. And the best way that you can do this is just to take your piece of card that you've done and measure this and then just cut it in half. And then you're going to know that you've got a piece that is 2½ inches high by half of what this card is going to be in terms of width. And just because I did the calculations, I know that the piece that I'm going to be dealing with is 2½ inches. Again, it's all 2½ inches high because I want to keep the same size as the card that I cut. So I've got 2½ inches. And then I know that it is just under 2 inches, just a teeny bit under 2 inches in terms of the size. So the two pieces that I have, in addition to the base, in the color cardstock, I have the piece that is going to be my inner card, which is eventually going to go in something like this. I will be putting that piece of designer series paper that I cut out on top of that. But when I open this, I want to have another piece of cardstock that is just going to cover where I'm going to open up that card. So I've cut my inner card to be a little bit higher and a little bit wider than the die cut piece. And I need to make sure that it's twice the length because I'm going to fold that over. And then for the other piece, I just need to make sure that it's half the size of the folded card. Okay. All right. Now let's start thinking about how we're going to put this together. The best way to do this is to put your middle card together. It's going to help you visually line some things up. So I'm going to make sure that I'm opening it correctly. It's going to open to the right. And when I put the designer series paper on, I'm also going to make sure that I'm putting that on correctly. I just want to line that up, make sure I've got my design going in the right place, which I do. So I know that that is the right orientation. And I'm just going to adhere that together. And probably not glue on that side. That would not be a good idea. Go ahead and glue this to that card. And I will send out the exact measurements for those of you who have the stitched rectangles. But again, if you have other dies, whether they are squares or rectangles, you will be able to develop your own measurements. And I'm just trying to get this centered as best as I can. All right. So now, what I want to eventually get when I put all of this together is I want this to look pretty seamless. I want it to look like the design that's on the front goes all the way across and life is good. But in order to do that, I need to be able to line this piece up and I need to be able to line this piece. And if I get it the way I want it, when this card is closed, it will cover up this card. It will align with it. So how am I going to do that? Well, here's what I found works. I'm going to take the piece that I just did. This is the inner card. I'm going to close up the outer card, and I'm going to push this all the way over to the inside so that I know that it's butted up against that crease. And what I want is I want to align the edges of that designer series paper. So where the cut is where I'm trying to align it. This is going to help me to see where that designer series paper should be. And visually, it looks like right here is where those align. And over here, they align as well. So now I know where I need to glue this piece, because I need that to be right at the edge, and I want it to be right at the edges of the color cardstock. So this is giving me a visual cue or clue as far as where I want to put that. So I'm just going to add some glue to this little piece that I've got. And I'm holding this flap down, and I'm just going to align that little piece so that it's right at the edge. So now I'm going to pick it up, and I'm just going to make sure that I can move that little piece of cardstock so that it's lined up right at the edge. And then if I bring it back down, everything nice and aligned, yay. It looks like it's in alignment. That's great. So now there's only one more piece that I need to glue, and it's this one. So how am I going to do that? Well, here's what I found worked, I think. And I'm going to use a couple pieces of washi and get these so they're not super sticky. And what I'm going to do is I can see the cardstock here. I can see the cardstock here. And what I'm going to try and do is just align them, just get them even and right on top of each other. And I'm also just going to look and see if when I do that, does it look like it's pretty straight? It actually does. So now I'm going to use my washi and I've tried to get some tackiness off of that. And I'm going to washi tape these two pieces together. That's going to allow me to move the front of the card. And then I can put glue on the back. This is what I want to glue down to the inside of the card. And I have it aligned, so it's gonna look good. And then all I need to do is fold the piece on top. Turn that over. And I can still see that things are lining up. It's looking pretty okay. You can see that this is lining up, that little swish is lining up, that little hill is lining up. Just going to give it a nice little push. And then I'm going to take that washi off. And let's see if this is working the way I want it to. So if I open this to the right, I open that to the left. Yep, it is working as I want it to, and the designer series paper design looks like it is continuous. So that works fine. So let's bring back in the finished card versus where we are and see what we still have left. And let's not focus on the front yet. Let's go to the middle. So on the inside, there are options. You definitely don't need to put a sentiment here. You could put another inked image. You could put another piece of designer series paper. There are a lot of different options. I chose to put some sentiments on both pieces. And I used the ones from the Artfully Layered stamp set. I used the Hey There on this piece. And then in the middle, I used the Happiest Birthday Wishes. So for the Happiest Birthday Wishes for the inside piece, this is going to be the same size as your die cut in the front. If you want to have the same border that goes all the way around in terms of the size. So you've got options. You could take that die cut that you used on the front and you can stamp an image or stamp a sentiment and then die cut that. I chose to use basic white because there is some white that is in the designer series paper and I just wanted to pull that in a little bit. And then for the ink, I thought that the Mossy Meadow looked really pretty. So that's what I used. But the size of the piece that you have on the inside, you may want to make the size that you have as the die cut. So that's very simple to do. And then you can put whatever sentiment you want. I did stamp on the back, but I'm going to adhere that anyway. Seeing which one I liked better. Put this one down. And you can also make this a different size if you want to. You could, again, put different images or a different piece of designer series paper. And I'm just going to try to get that centered. Piece of cardstock that is in the middle. So now we have the card within the card. And then for the other sentiment or whatever it is that you want to do, what you're going to do there is you're going to have half the size of your die cut. So you can, again, die cut your piece, cut it in half, and then use that as the piece that will go into the other piece of cardstock. Or you can measure this piece of cardstock and you can cut it to whatever size you would like that would fit nicely into that piece and give you a little bit of a frame. And that's what I did here. And I used the hay bear with the Mossy Meadow ink. And I just thought that was a really nice, fun, bright sentiment that could go with just about anything. And I'm going to do two things because I decided to make this the same size as the inside sentiment. They're both 2¼ inches tall. I just want to try and get those lined up so that they look pretty even when the person opens the card. Then the last thing that I chose to do on this card is I wanted to put a little bit of an embellishment on the outside. And I will show you what I used. I chose to use a couple of the dies from the Sunflower Dies set. They are really pretty foliage pieces. And they are these two. They're kind of little pieces of greenery. One is a double and one is a single. And I cut those out of Evening Evergreen because there's some Evening Evergreen in the designer series paper that I used. And then I wanted to add a little bit of kind of fun with some flowers. And I decided to just use one of the dies from the Meadows dies. And I cut only part of that die. I used one of the flowers. I love these dies. And I just cut one of the flowers at the top. And I used a scrap piece of paper. It was a great way to use up some scrap. And this is Bumblebee. The other was Pale Papaya. So obviously there are many colors that can be used on this one, depending upon what color you want to bring out in the designer series paper itself. And then I simply cut some of these flowers, like some of the buds and the flowers themselves, just did a little bit of trimming around the piece that I die cut. And after I put pieces of fauna, or I guess they're fauna, not floral, onto the panel, I added my cutout flowers. And then the last thing that actually two last things that I put on, I did use some of the absolutely gorgeous brass brushed butterflies, or brushed brass. Yes, either way is okay. I love these. They're just fun. So I added a couple in on the front there, and just use a little bit of twine, tied a bow, and put that right down at the bottom. So I hope you like this design. It is definitely fun to make. I will finish this one up with some of the die cuts that I just showed you and probably pretty much mimic what I did here. And then I'm very anxious to try this card with some other designs to see what they look like when I'm done, because I think they will be pretty as well. So try this, grab your rectangle dies or square die and have some fun with this. It's a really cool way to take one piece of designer series paper, again at 4 by 5¼ and make it into 3 panels and then put it back together so it looks like a continuous design with a nice little hidden message. Now, one option too that I should mention is you don't have to just put the sentiments on the inside. You could leave this completely blank. You could maybe put a stamped image on this piece, and you could put your sentiment on the outside. Maybe use a piece of vellum, do some wet embossing, put that on the top, wrap it around. You'd have a beautiful sentiment, and then you'd also still have a lot of space to write whatever it is that you want in terms of a message. So the options on this are pretty extensive, but I do hope you give it a try. It is a very fun card to make, and it's a great way to use the designer series paper, the New Horizons designer series paper. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I would love to see what you make.